Moses and other inspired writers recorded the history of God's people. They developed a chronology from Adam and Eve in 5800 BC to the captivity of the Jews in Babylon, which was a known historical date. In the last century, archaeologists, many of whom do not believe that the writings of Moses have any historical validity, collected archaeological and geologic data from the Middle East, or Near East as they call it. And the funny thing is that Moses' chronology correlates with the chronology of radiocarbon dating in archaeology. A correlation means that there is a one-to-one correspondence between two sets of data, or between a model and a set of data, such as in this graph. As with Adam and Eve here, we will be looking at the correlation. In this first of 4 videos, I will focus on establishing the Mosaic timeline and briefly touch on the corresponding archaeological observations. The following 3 videos will focus on the archaeological observations and their relation to the Mosaic timeline. Nathan Rouse was a Wesleyan minister and scholar in the 19th century. I couldn't find any pictures of him. He lived prior, I guess, to cameras and prior to radiometric dating of archaeological sites in the Middle East. He had no way to know what those archaeological dates would be. He compiled a chronology based on the writings of Moses and the work of earlier scholars. So his chronology is the basis for the chronology in this presentation, although I subtracted 70 years from all of his dates based on a mistake that I will show you in the period of Judges. So if Moses' timeline agrees with archaeology, then what is the problem? Well, for many years, archaeologists have noted that there are discrepancies between archaeological dates and the biblical or Mosaic chronology. The problem began in the 2nd century AD with a wonderful person named Aquila of Sinope, who was initially a convert to Christianity and then became disaffected when some of his views were criticized. So then he converted to Judaism. And because the Jews had expected the Messiah to come in the 6th millennium, which Jesus did, Aquila changed the chronology of the Old Testament in order to debunk the coming of Jesus as the Messiah, and he changed the creation date of Adam and Eve from 5800 BC to 3960 BC. And the Jews accepted this corrupted version of the dates, and this was incorporated into their Hebrew Masoretic text of the Old Testament. Well, in 1500 AD, along came Luther, and unsuspecting of this problem, although it had been mentioned many times in the past, he adopted the Masoretic text, which was the Hebrew text from the Jews of the Old Testament, when he broke away from the Catholic Church. And so the Protestants adopted that version of the chronology. The Catholics and Orthodox churches had never used the Jewish Masoretic text for their chronology. Instead, they used, and to continue to use, the Septuagint chronology. So most Middle East or Near East archaeologists in the 20th century were Jews and Protestants for some reason. I don't know why. There was a few Catholics like Father Vincent. And so the archaeologists concluded that Moses' dates were erroneous, or they adjusted the archaeological dates to fit their chronology, or they correlated biblical events with the wrong historical figures or events, depending on their presuppositions. So the Masoretic text is the column on the left. There was another chronology out there called the Samaritan chronology. That's in the 2nd column. The original Septuagint chronology, as it was typically interpreted, is in the 3rd column. And Rouse's adjustment of the typical Septuagint chronology, which includes this change of the date of Abraham's birth, or the time of Abraham's birth, from the 70th year of his father Terah to the 130th year of his father Terah. And so this would sum up the time from Adam to the flood as 2,262 years, and the time from the flood to the birth of Abraham as 1,132 years. So as you can see, the Masoretic text dropped 100 years from Adam to Enoch, the birth date of the children at the age of the father at the time of the birth date of their children. So in the Septuagint, the age of Adam when Seth was born is 230. In the Masoretic text, the age of Adam when Seth was born is 130. And so this is how Aquila got rid of all the years and decreased the date of Adam's creation from 5,800 to 4,000 BC. And you can see he also dropped the date of the father's age of their son's birth in the list from the flood to Abraham by 100 years. So here, they were generally about 130 years old when their children were born. Here, they were more like 200 years old when their children were born. And so now Aquila dropped it into the 30s, and then Terah, he had him at age 70. Well, the change to the Masoretic text by Aquila occurred in 130 AD, and one indication that it hadn't changed before that is that there were many historians prior to that time, and Christ and the apostles used both the Septuagint and Hebrew text, and none of them mentioned any difference in the dates. So that would indicate that there was no difference in the dates. And the 70 translators of the Septuagint, which was the translation from the Hebrew into Greek in the 3rd century BC, were very careful to keep the original meaning. For example, Philo was a Jew in Alexandria in 40 AD, and he mentioned how important it was for the Septuagint translators to exactly follow the Hebrew text. He said, considering among themselves how important the affair was to translate laws which had been divinely given by direct inspiration, since they were not able either to take away anything or to add anything or to alter anything, but were bound to preserve the original form and character of the whole composition. So many early Christian scholars noted that the Hebrew text chronology had been changed. One who described this was St. Augustine. He stated that the Jews were suspected of having corrupted their copies of the ancient scriptures, and particularly of having altered the generations and lives of the antediluvian patriarchs. Those are the people from Adam to the flood. And this they did, says he, out of dislike to the Christians and in order to weaken the authority of the Septuagint. Abul Faragius, who was the primate of the East, made the same accusation, and I'm just going to skip to the red writing. The rabbis subtracted from Adam's age when he begat Seth 100 years and added them to the remainder of his life, and they did the same in the lives of most of his posterity down to Abraham. So these are the Septuagint dates that I'm going to show correlate with archaeology. And these dates range from a few hundred years older than the Masoretic text in this range to a few thousand older up in the range of Adam and Eve and Noah's flood. So Nathan Rouse published this list of dates in his chronology in 1856, and I've highlighted the 8 dates that I will correlate with archaeology in this and the following presentations. And as I stated previously, I have subtracted 70 years from Rouse's dates, which means that they are all the same relative distance from each other, which means with respect to just correlation, it really doesn't change the correlation of Moses' writing and the archaeological dates, which I'll show you. So in this slide, the estimated dates of creation of Adam and Eve are arranged from youngest to oldest. And so we have this timeline on the left. And so this would be the date that St. Augustine estimated Adam was created, 5330 BC. And this would be the date Rouse estimated Adam was created in 5833 BC. My estimate, which is subtracting about 70 years from Rouse, is 5760 BC. One of Rouse's heroes was Manetho, an Egyptian historian from 300 BC. He estimated 5877 BC. So in this graph, I plotted estimates of the date of creation by scholars versus the year in which they made the estimate. And my current estimate of 5760 BC is shown by this green line. Modern Protestants use the 4000 BC date of the Masoretic text, which is why this line starts in 1500 AD at the time of the Protestant Revolution. So I pulled this estimated list of dates of creation of Adam and Eve from Rouse's book. And if you'd like to pause the video and look at them closer, you can do so. So many parts of the chronology are straightforward, but there are a few complicated spots and not every chronologist agrees. For example, Moses stated that Terah had 3 children at the age of 70, and the first in the list was Abraham. Thus, many chronologists have placed Abraham's birth at Terah's age 70. However, Moses stated that Abraham left Haran after his father died, and Terah died when he was 205 years old, and Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. Thus, Abraham was 130 years old, or Terah was 130 years old when Abraham was born. Abraham was only listed first because he was the most important of the 3 children. And I think this was the only time in the genealogies that there were 3 sons listed at one time. In other cases, Moses just listed 1 son and stated that the person had other sons and daughters. Another area of disagreement is the length of time that the Israelites were in Egypt. In general, Catholics and Orthodox think that the Israelites were in Canaan for 215 years, in Egypt for 215 years, for a total of 430 years, which is why Exodus 12:40 in the Catholic version has added, I think, Canaan and Egypt was 430 years, instead of just Egypt in the Masoretic text and the Protestant versions. So most Protestants and Jews think that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years, with the 430 years commencing with Jacob's migration into Egypt. Rouse studied Egyptian history, writings of scholars, and biblical texts, and concluded that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. He pointed out that Abraham and his descendants were not afflicted in Canaan, and thus the affliction was only in Egypt in Genesis 15:13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted 400 years. Likewise, Acts 7:6 indicates that they were enslaved in one place for 400 years, which would be Egypt. And so I think the Protestants and Jews were correct in this case, and that the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. One of the most difficult periods for chronologists is the period of the Judges. I saw one entire book written on interpretations of the period of the Judges. And one key to the interpretation is that the Apostle Paul referred to a 450-year period either before or during the period of Judges, depending on the translation. So in the old interpretation of Acts 13 in the King James Version, the Apostle Paul stated that it was 450 years from the division of the land to the prophet Samuel. So here's what Paul said. And after that, he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years. So that would be from the division of the land to Samuel. Well, the modern translations have changed that to, and this is all the modern translations I could see. This is just the NASB, New American Standard Bible. After these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet, meaning after the 450 years, he gave them judges. And the reason they did that was that the original translation didn't agree with 1 Kings 6:1, which states that the period from the Exodus to the construction of Solomon's temple was 480 years, which implies that the period of Judges is about 300 years long rather than 450 years, as Paul stated, as I think Paul stated. And so they got rid of that problem of a disagreement between the dates. But Nathan Rouse observed that the existence of the 480 years from Exodus to the temple in 1 Kings 6:1 is not known before the time of Origen, who lived around 200 AD. So he stated, Rouse stated that at the time he lived, that it was almost universally considered to be a forgery. So Josephus was a famous Jewish historian. I've already mentioned him once, I think, in the 1st century AD, and he stated that the time from the Exodus to the construction of the Temple of Solomon was 592 years. So in the 1st century, one would think that that was the typical estimate. And Josephus' estimate of 592 years agrees with standard estimates of chronology, where there was 40 years from the Exodus to Moses' death to the division of the land, which was the period of Joshua's conquest, was 8 years. Then there was 450 years from the division of the land to Samuel's appointment as a prophet. Then after Samuel was a prophet, Eli continued to administer Israel for 18 years. Then there was 20 years of servitude to the Philistines, 12 years administration of Samuel. Then King Saul reigned for 40 years, King David reigned for 40 years, and then King Solomon began to erect the temple in the 4th year, so I said there was 3 years. So that's a total of 593 years, which agrees almost exactly with Josephus' estimate. And I just want to say that I got this list from somebody who did not agree, well, actually Rouse, who did not have the same interpretation of Judges. So these weren't just invented by me. Okay, so here's where I think Rouse made an interpretation of the period of Judges. He started the Apostle Paul's, you can see here, 450 years with the first judge, Othniel, which he stated was a completely unprecedented interpretation at the time. He said, every chronological exposition that we recollect to have seen dates the commencement of the 450 years, not from the appointment of the first judge, but from the division of the land. So he went against everyone else in this interpretation. So in order to add 70 years to the period of Judges to agree with the Apostle Paul's 450 years, he added these intervals for apostasy, which were 13 or 14 years long. He added 5 of them, which I think totaled 66 years. But anyway, I added back in 70 years, because if we go back to the original interpretation, which is the division of the land here, it's exactly 450 years to here where Samuel's appointed as a prophet. So because Rouse overestimated all the dates, such as the Exodus, by 70 years in comparison to archaeology, and because his interpretation was unprecedented, I went ahead and removed 70 years from Rouse's timeline. So I made a timeline of Rouse's dates on the left, which you can see are about 70 years too high in this range, and not quite so high compared to the archaeological dates represented by the blue lines. So here's my correlations. Adam and Eve were the ancestors of the Ubaid, who began in 5800 BC, according to archaeology. The deluge or the flood was the Great Earth Flood in 3500 BC. which, contrary to most people's belief, was a flood that covered all of Lower Mesopotamia. Then the Tower of Babel was the collapse of the Uruk Empire in 3100 BC. And I'll show you lots of correlations between the two stories, Moses and archaeology. Sodom and Gomorrah is correlated with, I think, the largest earthquake in the region in the last, several thousand years. And in that region, earthquakes in the Dead Sea, earthquakes release hydrogen sulfide, which is highly explosive. Then Jacob left Canaan, and that's correlated with the Canaan drought. This is the worst, if not the worst, one of the worst droughts in history in that region. Right when he left, or right when, in my timeline, 2080 BC. Then the Exodus in 1720 BC is correlated with the end of the 14th dynasty in 1650 BC, and the conquest of Canaan is correlated with the conquest of Canaan, as indicated by the destruction of many cities in that area in about 1600 BC. So here are my dates. I guess you could call them Rouse's dates, minus 70 years, where there's perfect agreement almost between all the dates and the corresponding events in archaeology. So I've decreased Adam and Eve to 5760. Actually, that's no closer to 5800. And likewise, Rouse's date of 3570 is correlated with one person's estimate of the date of greater flood. So in this earlier period, it wasn't quite as critical to adjust the dates. I also didn't need to for Tower of Babel. But for these dates down here, where it's the period in Egypt, I did need to adjust the dates so that they agreed with the archaeological dates. So here I just show that shifting the earlier dates really didn't decrease the correlation. I just went from 5833 to 5760, and the estimate by archaeologists is 5800. I went from 3570 to 3500. There recently Al-Shaikhli estimated 3600. Traditional estimated date of the greater flood is 3500 BC. The Tower of Babel is based on the naming of Peleg and Eber. Peleg's name means the land is divided, so he would have to be named after the Tower of Babel, and Eber would be named before the Tower of Babel. So that's both estimates, the Rouse's original chronology and the minus 7 years chronology, both contain the 3100 BC date for the end of the Uruk Empire. And Sodom and Gomorrah, Rouse estimated 2339, the earthquake's 2300, and my date's 2269. And you can see that at least this one and this one, the archaeological dates have some uncertainty, and they contain both Rouse's original date and my adjusted date. So enough of that. So I just summarizing here the three phases of Israelite history that are supported by archaeology. You can see that it covers about 4,000 years. So actually a change of 70 years is pretty insignificant. But I think that the Garden of Eden occurred in 5800 BC. The Ubaid culture transitioning to the violent Uruk culture took place from 5800 to 3500. And then the flood took place in 3500. Here's Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, drought in Canaan and Egypt. And then Moses' birth, Exodus, and conquest of Canaan in the Middle Bronze Age. So you might question whether my correlations of Moses' writings with archaeological events are valid, but I will show in the following videos that there's a strong reason to correlate each of the events in this list with the corresponding archaeological event. So I plotted the dates of events based on Moses' chronology on the Y or left axis against the corresponding dates in archaeology on the X or lower axis. And the brown markers are Rouse's original dates, and the blue markers are Rouse's dates minus 70 years, as I am using in my chronology. I then calculated the correlation coefficient, which is the linear dependence of two sets of data. In this case, the correlation coefficient is almost exactly 1.0, which implies perfectly correlated data. That's not my words, that's what I read from the description of the correlation coefficient. The interesting thing is that Rouse's original dates from his list in 1856 are just as perfectly correlated, according to the correlation coefficient, as the subtracted 70 years dates that I'm using. And the reason for this is that the 70 years subtraction is based on an error that was outside of the range of the writings of Moses and Joshua. And the funny thing is, just looking at the correlation in general, is that Rouse had no way to know what the radiocarbon dates would be when he made his list. And not only is there a high correlation between the entire list and archaeology, but I numbered the corresponding characteristics for each event described by Moses and the corresponding archaeological event. Thus, each point in the correlation that I just showed you is represented by 3 to 8 correlations between Moses' description and the corresponding archaeological event. Thank you for watching.